Hey everyone, hi, welcome back to my channel. Today I wanted to talk about the Pulitzer Prize for fiction, and I want to talk about one aspect of the Pulitzer since it's been on my mind for the last couple of days. Actually, the Pulitzer, since it's been announced, there's been so much talk about the dual winners of 2023, which I will get into. And there's just been a huge conversation about the Pulitzer, and I have been thinking about the Pulitzer from a different perspective, and I wanted to dive into that today, the different the sort of different angle in which my brain has been thinking about the Pulitzer. I'm going to be doing that while getting ready, so just, grab a cup of tea or a snack, or perhaps this can be playing in the background while you're doing something else. And and that's how this video is gonna go. So if you are new to my channel, then hello, hi, I'm Shelly. And for all of those who are not new, hello. You all know that I'm Shelly. I absolutely love all things books and reading. And for right now, actually, I think the sun is gonna come in and assault me in a minute. But if you are new to my channel and you haven't yet subscribed, I would encourage you to subscribe. For all of you who are here, perhaps like the video or leave me a comment down below about your relationship with the Pulitzer. And I'm going to be doing all of this while putting on makeup and getting my hair done or fixed up. And without further ado, let's go ahead and get into the meat of this video. If I chat with you all in the early morning, then what happens is that the sun comes in right to my face, and it really it does a doozy by basically blinds me, but it's okay, we're fine. So the aspect of the Pulitzer that has been on my mind isn't the fact that there have been two winners this year. So in 2023, there were awarded the Pulitzer Prize for Fiction. I can't even get it out, I'm so excited. The Pulitzer Prize for Fiction awarded two winners, which to my knowledge has never happened in the history of the award. Actually, some years the Pulitzer has decided not to give anyone the winning medal for the Pulitzer Prize for Fiction, but this year they decided to give it to two. Maybe they're, catching up from past years of awarding no one. And so this year, Hernan Diaz for his book Trust, and Barbara Kingsolver for her book Demon Copperhead, which I am reading right now, have won. So congratulations to those two authors. It's a really exciting time for the Pulitzer, and for them to have awarded two is really fascinating. If you don't know much about the process of the Pulitzer, I've been looking into that, but there is a board of trustees, or there is a board of folks that make the final decision, and there is also a jury, like five jurors. So what the jurors do is that they make some decisions as to what three books should be nominated, and they also put forth a recommendation for the winner of the Pulitzer, the small group of five, and they present that to the board, and occasionally the board will disagree and give nobody the award, and very occasionally they will overrule the recommendation and give it to someone else. And actually that happened with, I have my small collection, and this isn't by no means the full collection of my Pulitzer Prize winning books, but I have a small collection of Pulitzer Prize winning novels right here, ones that I've read and could easily talk about, and that I gathered sort of in a moment's notice. And that actually happened and I set this up so I could set the books on top of it and also have my hands to do some makeup, but I'm not using my hands for makeup right now. But anyways, The Age of Innocence, that happened with The Age of Innocence. And give me a moment, I will actually tell you what book it overruled. Okay, so in 1921, when the Pulitzer Prize for Fiction was only 4 years old, the jury recommendation said that Lewis Sinclair's Main Street should win. That was their recommendation for the winner. And instead, the trustees overruled the jury recommendation with Edith Wharton's The Age of Innocence, which I read last year. It was one of my favorite novels of last year. It was so fantastic. Set in the Roaring 20s, which is just so good. And it's, Old New York. I wanted to make sure. Old New York and of high society. It has just an incredible narrator of Archer and his very mixed feelings about a couple of women in his life. The setting is beautiful. Edith Wharton's writing is superb. I mean, superb, just incredible. And I'm so glad that it won because otherwise I think Edith Wharton perhaps would have fallen by the wayside, to be honest with you. I think that one of the shining moments in her career, at least now living 100 years later, is the fact that she was one of the first Pulitzer Prize winners, and that Age of Innocence sits on such a prestigious list like the Pulitzer, or on a prestigious list such as the Pulitzer. I'm gonna get going real quick, and then we will talk about the aspect that is really kind of getting my goat, getting me to think about the Pulitzer and what it means. I am thinking about the definition of the Pulitzer and the particular aspect in which it has said and changed its definition over the years of it being a distinguished prize for fiction written by an American author, preferably dealing with American life. And I really wanted to dive into that today. But of course, I forgot a mirror. I'll go get that. So the definition of the Pulitzer Prize for Fiction and how the parameters for which it gets rewarded has changed over the years. So originally, this is the definition. It was annually, the prize will be given annually for the American novel published during the year which shall best present the wholesome atmosphere of American life and the highest standard of American manners and manhood. There was a struggle as to whether we should use, or they should use, the word whole or wholesome, and in 1927 there was a transition, and so instead they decided to replace the word wholesome with whole. Interesting, because wholesome I think of as like sort of modest. I think of the word modest when I think of wholesome, and so that's an interesting change right there. Then in 1929, there was another change, and the board changed the wording to, the word shall be given to a novel in fiction, preferring one which shall best present the whole atmosphere of American life. And they deleted the phrasing, the highest standard of American manners and manhood. So we're seeing this evolution, and they've made the wording a bit more concise. And then a mere 7 years later, in 1936, there was another change, and it says that the award is going to go to a distinguished novel published during the year by an American author, preferably dealing with American life. And then again, we get another change in 1948, and they decided to widen the scope, and they said, for distinguished fiction published in book form during the year by an American author, preferably dealing with American life. So let me try that again. So it's for distinguished fiction published in book form during the year by an American author, preferably dealing with American life. And I really wanted to and that was in 1948. And so since then, for about 75 years now, we've had this wording for the Pulitzer Prize for Fiction. So we're dealing with an author published something in book form, so no magazine articles or long form essays or anything like that, no short stories. And we are dealing with the phrasing, preferably dealing with American life. So I know that there has been some confusion as to what that means, and I wanted to dive into this small sample size of books to help clarify for myself, and perhaps you all will get something from it, as to what that phrasing actually means and what the Pulitzer board, what the jurors are looking for when they're dealing with a novel. My hair is starting to bug me, so I'm going to take it down and also add a little bit of blush. How pretty is this color of blush? How gorgeous is that? Isn't that just stunning? I am also reading Demon Copperhead right now. In this moment, I'm about halfway through. And if you are so interested, or if you are like curious about my thoughts about Demon Copperhead thus far, I will leave that to the very end of the video. I will also try and leave timestamps because I have a feeling this might be a bit of a longer video and it might help you navigate what's going on. But sometimes I'm so chaotic, or I'm so kind of all over the place, that timestamps really don't work. But you know, YouTube is just doing it anyways. They're just adding timestamps in and naming it whatever the robotic system thinks that you're trying, you know, whatever. They're just like naming it whatever. And so sometimes it's better to just take the reins and name the conversation myself and lay out a format myself, rather than having YouTube come around and sort of chapterize my videos in its own sort of weird robotic way. All right, so there we go. I'm gonna take my hair down. One of the fascinating things that I have found while diving a bit more into the Pulitzer, actually the Pulitzer has been a prize very close to my heart. I've read several Pulitzer Prize winning novels, and whenever it's just one of those awards that has really piqued my interest for a very, very long time. It's a very American award. And I have been thinking about, when it says preferably dealing with American life, one of the things that I think, or one of, how do I say it? It is very, it's exclusionary in some ways, this wording. And what it is excluding is that if you're talking specifically about American life, you know, we are cutting out like genre fiction in a lot of ways. And I'm specifically talking about science fiction and fantasy. So if you look back, and please correct me if I am wrong, kindly, you know, in a very kind way. But we don't see a lot of fantasy novels. I think of Cormac McCarthy's The Road, which is a dystopian novel that, you know, that is a bit of an outlier, but mostly we are dealing with fiction, like general fiction, in that, or contemporary. It's set now, or in the very near past, in our living memory, or it's a historical fiction piece. And we see that very much so with something like Gone with the Wind. This is historical fiction. Beloved is historical fiction. Middlesex is dealing with a few decades before, a few decades before it was published. I think it's like set in the 60s perhaps, and it was published in the early 2000s. And so even, right here, especially in this stack that I own and have read, you're dealing with not high fantasy novels. You're not, science fiction works. It's more of the realistic fiction type setting or historical fiction. So I thought that was a really interesting distinction. So even if a really fantastic fantasy novel that comes out and has a lot of commentary about what America is doing and maybe perhaps our current system, and it's a critique on our, late stage capitalism or our consumerist society. But it's set in this very perhaps high fantasy society or something like that. It's really got a very, very low chance of winning the Pulitzer, which is so fascinating. Also, if we are dealing with, have less of a chance of winning if you are an American author, you write a book, and it is set not in the US. All of these books are set in the United States. So we have Macomb, Alabama, which is a fictionalized county in Alabama. With Gone with the Wind, you have the Deep South. I know some of it is set in Charleston and some of it is set in Georgia, I believe. It's been a minute since I've read this. Donna Tartt's The Goldfinch is set partly in Las Vegas and partly on the East Coast, I believe in New York. The Age of Innocence set in New York. Beloved set in, I think it's in more of like the northern U.S. Give me a moment. Set in Ohio, post-Civil War Ohio. And Middlesex is set in Detroit, I believe. All right, at this point, I want to go through, hopefully rather briefly, so it doesn't go on and on and on and on and on about each of these books and in what way they are dealing with American life. And so, first off, we have Jeffery Eugenides, Middlesex. And this is a multi-generational family saga where the Stepanades, I believe it is, the Stefanades, as I pronounce it, which is a family who immigrated, or rather a couple. No, there's more than just the couple. A family that has immigrated from a tiny village in Greece, and now they're living in Detroit and in suburban Michigan. And he covers some of the race riots that broke out in Detroit. And there's like a really long, interesting and cinematic scene dedicated to the race riots in 1967. And ultimately, the whole story it comments about the immigrant experience and what that looks like through generations, having parents who are immigrants and are in some ways trying to figure out American life. And it also talks about gender in a really fascinating and interesting way, and what it means to grow up as a woman, or with a feminine or a female body. And there's a lot of commentary about that and what that feels like and what that means because of the sort of the twist in the book. It's not really a twist. He talks about it from the very beginning. And so the whole aspect of it, the whole conversation Jeffery Eugenides is having is, in a lot of ways, what does it mean to be American? Like, it is like really digging at the heart of that, especially when your parents have immigrated here, especially when you are at the heart of a city that ends up crumbling, because Detroit, Michigan, it had its moment. It had its moment of really flourishing, and then at some point, which I know people who are better at American history than I am can really explain this better than I can, but it ends up falling apart and becoming a decrepit, crawling city that no longer flourishes and is really a dying flower on its stem. It's just wilted and faded. And he does such a good job painting these scenes for his readers. And so in an essence, this is an incredibly American book. And I could see why it won the Pulitzer. All right, next up I have To Kill a Mockingbird by Harper Lee, one of my favorite books of all time, although I really need to reread it, to be honest with you. And this is set in Macomb, Alabama, and it is really dealing with, I think part of the whole preferably dealing with American life, like, it has to be set in the US. I know some of the winners have not been set in the US, but I think that is a huge contribution as to gaining a point towards, winning or towards being honored by the Pulitzer, is that it really ought to be set in the US. I know not every winner and honoree is set in the US, but I think that is a key factor for most of the winners. That's a better way of saying it. And so, here we are in Macomb, Alabama, and it's talking about the South and the continuing, which now it makes me sad to say that, like, we really haven't gone very far. We haven't progressed in the way that we should have, considering that this won in 1960. But Harper Lee is talking very clearly, she writes very clearly about the issues in the South. And I know that this is not a perfect book. However, there is a lot that's in it that is so gripping and interesting and fascinating, because Harper Lee is considering what it means to be a person of color in the South, what it means to be someone who is poor living in the South, living in a small town, and what that means, and the responsibilities that we have as a community and the way that we see each other. It was just really fascinating. I think one of my favorite things about Harper Lee's book, To Kill a Mockingbird, is her character work. There's like the judge who, chews on his cigar as he's listening to the lawyers present their arguments. You have Atticus, you have Scout, you have Atticus, the lawyer who is defending a black man in the community who has been accused of rape. And it's just a fascinating portrait of the South at this time. And so I think I completely understand why it won. Her writing is gorgeous. And again, I understand it's not a perfect book. It really isn't. But it has so much to say about American life. And it's so much more than just a novel. I mean, her prose work is gorgeous and all of that. So I can definitely see why it was chosen to win the Pulitzer, and its contributions to its contributions about what American life is, especially about the South and the experience of being a Southerner living in a small, teeny town in the South. Really a fascinating book, to say the least. Probably one of the most controversial books I've read in my life. Even when I talk about it on booktube, so it still continues to spark controversy, which is Margaret Mitchell's Gone with the Wind. This is a fascinating book because it is a romance. I mean, essentially at the heart of it is a romance novel. It is really interesting that this book won the Pulitzer and that it was a bestseller in its day. I think it really says, so as a historical piece of information, what this book is, what this book represents is utterly fascinating. I find it endlessly fascinating because Margaret Mitchell had a lot to say about race. She is, let's just say, I very much disagree with Margaret Mitchell and her portrayal of Black Americans during this time period. And it's almost gut-wrenchingly hard to read, at least for me. And it's interesting that this was the winner of the Pulitzer Prize. It's really interesting that it sold as many books as it has and had. And it continues to fascinate me when people say they love this book. So essentially, it is about the Civil War. And it is about a young woman who came from wealth named Scarlett O'Hara. And Scarlett is a viciously unlikable character. She's spoiled. She is entitled. And the Civil War being fought right in her backyard, essentially, really, it changes her life. And it really helps her gain grit, and she has this, it's also about, like, the book is about survival. It's about, like, doing all the things possible in order to continue to put food on the table, to try and live a new life beyond what happened during the Civil War. It's about a community that was torn apart because of the Civil War. And then it's also about love and, the banter between Scarlett O'Hara and Rhett Butler is just some of it is hilarious. Some of it is, charming. So the book it's a lot. It's a lot of a book too. I mean, it's huge. It's a huge book. There's so much going on. It is weirdly readable in some instances, but in a lot of there are just some instances that for me are just basically like unforgivable. So it's really hard for me to recommend this book for literary merit alone. Like, I cannot recommend this book for literary merit alone, but to understand a portrait of America during this time and when this was a bestseller, and to gain understanding about the mindset of Americans during which this won the Pulitzer and during the years for which it was a bestseller is absolutely fascinating. As an artifact of history, this is a wildly interesting book. But the book itself, for the story alone, is, I just cannot recommend it. But I mean, obviously I'm going on and on and on, but it continues to, it's just a fascinating book to think about. And I'm so glad I read it, in the fact that I can now, continue. It's a touchstone in my thinking. It's a touchstone of understanding of where America was at when this book was published. And, Margaret Mitchell, she only wrote one book, just like Harper Lee. And it won the Pulitzer, and it was unusual that it won the Pulitzer because at the heart of it, it's a romance novel, although it does say a ton about the Civil War and where America was at during that time. And I got a mascara fleck on my face, and that's annoying me. And so it's really interesting, and it is a very American book, like, whether we like it or not. Super American, especially because, I mean, it even sold millions of copies. I mean, the whole rigmarole of this book is just fascinating. And I will leave it at that. I'm going to stop rambling on and on. Now, if a book written like this today won, it would be a no-go. It would be atrocious. I'm just going to stop talking about the book, but hopefully you can understand why it won and why it won for it preferably dealing with American life, because this is a very American book, and probably to much of its detriment, is it so. Okay, so now I'm so glad to have, I'm glad I'm done with Margaret Mitchell, and now we're moving on to Toni Morrison, which feels like a palate cleanser after talking about Margaret Mitchell for 10 minutes. Beloved, oh my goodness. So Beloved is set in Ohio, and we are following a former slave, a woman who is now a free woman, Setha, and it is dealing with her past. Now, I said earlier that, we're not going to get any high fantasy books as winners of the Pulitzer, at least to my knowledge, or, deeply sci-fi reads, science fiction reads. But interestingly, Beloved by Toni Morrison, also Colson Whitehead's books, especially The Underground Railroad, very magical realist. Like, there is very much magical realistic moments in this book, and also in Colson Whitehead's The Underground Railroad, deeply, deeply so. And so it's dealing with Nobel Prize. Did it win the Pulitzer? Yes, it won the Pulitzer. I was like, oh my gosh, did I get this wrong? No, it won the Pulitzer in 1988. So this has magical realistic elements to it, and it is talking very much about life after being a slave and carrying around post-traumatic stress disorder, which feels like an understatement for a character like Setha, who has gone through, I think, every mother's worst nightmare. And in a lot of ways, I think it's about confronting one's past, even though it is really difficult. And in a lot of ways, this book is, kind of goes off the rails a little bit, but in the best possible way. But there are moments that stick with me. Whenever I reflect on it, there is this heaviness in my heart because as a mother, as a woman, and thinking about Setha and the choices that she made because of the trauma that she went through is heart-wrenching. It's absolutely heart-wrenching. And I think that this deals with American life, but has a lot of, in regards that it has a lot of commentary about post like life after being a slave and the trauma that they carry. And for that, I mean, absolutely deserving of the Pulitzer. Just an incredible read. All right, next up we have The Goldfinch. The Goldfinch really swept like all the awards of its year. It won the Pulitzer. It won, I believe, the Women's Prize for Fiction, or at least it was nominated for it. I mean, everybody and their mother read this book and seemed to have liked it. This follows Theodore Decker. It's set partly in New York. And there is a moment in which an act of terrorism seems to happen. Like you can deduce it. And I don't think that's a spoiler. And for Theodore Decker, that really changes his life. And then he lives, he goes to live in Vegas for a little while. Again, these are vague, like, if you don't want to know anything about the book, I would, perhaps skip this part. But I mean, these are really not spoilers. And there is a lot of commentary about trauma and drug use and about art. And in a lot of ways, this actually, of all the books, and perhaps it's because this won rather recently, I believe it won in 2014. Wonder if the Pulitzer Prize, I think it won in 2014. And in a lot of ways, it does talk about American life, but it talks more about, I think, the soul of an American. I don't know. I feel like when I reflect back on this book, it is really more about morality, but it does have this sense of it being squarely in the sense that it's very U.S. centric. The setting of Vegas, the setting of New York, and this access to drugs. And so I don't know. I feel like this is actually the least American. But again, I don't know if it's because the other books, it feels like we're in this other time and place. Perhaps because other books are historical fiction or they were written so long ago. Like To Kill a Mockingbird, we're coming up on, was written 60 plus years ago. And so it feels as if it is in a different place. And so you can see the commentary about American life at that time because it's so far removed from my life now or from our lives now. This feels so contemporary, I'm like, it talks about art and choices that we make. And it's almost like it's hard for me to see the forest from the forest from the trees. Is that the phrase? Like, it's hard for me to see the picture clearly because I'm like, it feels so contemporary. Like it just happened. This story could have happened yesterday, and it would, it's very much of that vein. But I think, so maybe those of you who are like, my viewers or those of you who are community members that don't live in the U.S., and maybe you can see the U.S.-ness in it, like you could see the American-ness in it. But what I think is like, the fact that, there's, Theodore Decker's at a museum and he's in Vegas, and then he goes back to New York, and again, not a spoiler, but goes back to New York and works, does work in an antique shop. And I'm like, are these things very American, or could it have been set anywhere? I don't know. I don't know. So this one, I'm like, I can't really pull the Americanness out of it. However, the next one I can for sure. My last one, The Age of Innocence by Edith Wharton. This is like, New York has its own personality. I mean, it is set in New York and it's of the high society in New York. And what's so funny is that like the high society of New York is a character. There's a family that likes art and there's another family who I believe likes food. And they're sort of, you know, they're like, you know, you're part of one family, you're part of another family. And in a lot of ways, it's talking about a very specific kind of life in the US during a very specific time period. And Edith Wharton captures that perfectly. I mean, truly perfectly in the way that, like, again, even like New York itself. And so New York itself is a character, the high society of New York is a character, and then you actually have the characters in the novel who are characters, of course. And it's just so good. I mean, I love this book. I love it so much. It has some commentary about what it means to be a female of this time period in this society, which I think is very astute for its time. And of course, the writing is beautiful. So, you know, it's like for most of these novels, besides the Goldfinch, which is like, you know, it's like it's about a painting, it's about drugs, it's about terrorist attack in Vegas and all this other morality and all this stuff. So it's like this book, I had the hardest time pulling out what is so American about it that it would have won the Pulitzer. You know, what is it doing that is distinctly American? I cannot really tell you. But for everything else, it has commentary about, for To Kill a Mockingbird, the Deep South. We'll kind of do a wrap up. So the life in the rural U.S. in the Deep South, that is what To Kill a Mockingbird is commenting on, and also about race relations during that time and the injustices of the way that we were viewing race. You know, Gone with the Wind is clearly talking about the Civil War and about race relations, but one that I disagree with, and about life after the Civil War and what that means. The Age of Innocence, clearly New York, and what, you know, New York is a character, very, very clear as to what high society New York felt like during the Roaring 20s. Beloved, the life of a slave in the U.S. and the traumas that slaves carry with them, and what that means, and how that affects who they are as a person. And the Middlesex is the immigrant experience and trying to live the American dream while coming over from another country, and what the American dream means in a lot of ways. So it's like all of these books, I can pull out exactly what is American life for these books, quoting the award, you know, the award definition, and I could probably do that with other books that I've read. And again, it says preferably, so it doesn't have to, but it's like these books are clearly commenting about America during those time periods, during those dates. And I find that really fascinating. Okay, and so then let's get to Barbara Kingsolver. Barbara Kingsolver. I'm only halfway through Barbara Kingsolver's Demon Copperhead. I have not read David Copperfield by Charles Dickens. And so I'm coming at it with just, you know, no baggage. Maybe not even, no context really. You know, I've not read much of Dickens. I've only read A Christmas Carol. And so as I'm reading Barbara Kingsolver's not the Poisonwood Bible, Demon Copperhead, I'm finding it really interesting, partly because the voice of Demon, who is our main character, is very distinct. He is representing someone who has lived a tough life. You know, there's a lot of like F-bombs and comparisons to certain things that just feels very like, you know, like he grew up understanding the difficulties of life. And he's obsessed with comic books, Marvel and DC Comics. And what's funny about that is that I think that is like such an American thing. There are a couple of scenes that also talks about the South in a very particular way. So she has a scene about the tobacco industry. She has a scene with a garbage dump. And she has a couple of scenes now that I'm heading towards the midway point, set in, about education and Demon's educational experience. She's also critical of the drug epidemic and the foster care system. Barbara Kingsolver is. And that really comes through in her novel. But what I think she's doing is that I feel like she's capturing the voice of a young man who has grown up poor and doesn't have a lot of access to certain life events. Like, for example, he's obsessed with seeing the ocean. And I feel like she captures that voice so sincerely. And she does that all while making comments about America, about the U.S., particularly the southern U.S., during the 1990s. And I think she's doing it really well. And so I can definitely, and the book is extremely accessible, which I feel like is a stark contrast to Joshua Cohen's The Netanyahus, which nobody had really heard of before it won the Pulitzer last year. And so I'm really glad that she won. I cannot say anything about Trust by Herman Diaz. I didn't want to, sometimes I write books off. I'm like, that book is not for me. And then I cycle back around and read it. That's what I did with Barbara Kingsolver's Demon Copperhead. I was like, I'm not going to read it. Now here I am reading it and I'm really enjoying it. But I'm less, I have less to say about Trust by Herman Diaz. But I can definitely see why Barbara Kingsolver won. It's like this accessible, incredibly readable, incredibly thoughtful in some ways, and does a really lovely job sketching out certain aspects of American life during the 1990s that I think are difficult to capture, or that we ourselves, haven't necessarily thought of. But she just does it really, really well so far. And so I'm enjoying the book. I have thoughts, clearly. And I really enjoyed sharing this with you. So thank you for letting me do like an extensive deep dive into books, the Pulitzer, and one aspect of the definition of the Pulitzer Prize for fiction and what that means to me, and just kind of going on this thought journey with me. So I'm ready. I've done the getting ready. I have talked about the books. I've given you my thoughts about Barbara Kingsolver. And so thank you so much for watching. Thank you so much for spending this time with me. I deeply appreciate it. And I hope to see you all in my next one. Bye.